So as we mentioned in the last class and the one before, Martin Luther had sort of launched this campaign in Germany against the Church of the Pope, and therefore, against the Catholic Church in 1517, really protesting the Catholic Church until its abuses were corrected. And among the many abuses of the Catholic Church, you can go and read his 95 Theses online. He criticized how the Catholic Church preached that sins could be forgiven by the purchase of a letter of indulgence approved by the Pope, allowing souls to essentially skip time in purgatory and enter straight into heaven. And the money toward these indulgences was actually being put toward the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Martin Luther's time. But Luther, in protest, claimed it should be paid for by the wealthy Pope himself. And so Luther wrote his 95 Theses, which was supposed to, among other things, inspire a debate about the issue of these indulgences. And so Protestantism, or the Christian movement in protest of the Catholic Church, rose up with Martin Luther and John Calvin. They rejected the Pope's claim to be their spiritual leader and focused instead on the individual's relationship to the divine. They downplayed all of the collective rituals of the Catholic Church and ecclesiastical hierarchy in favor of studying scripture alone, rejecting the traditions of the church. This produced a much more academically focused Christianity, a much more literary Christianity. And so for the rest of the century, various strains of Protestantism developed, all of which emphasize, salvation by faith alone. So, now confession to a priest, pilgrimages, and good works could not save you as they could in the Catholic Church. So in Protestantism, the authority of Scripture trumped the authority of the Church in all cases. In addition, each strain of Protestantism rejected the cults of the saints as a sort of vestigial pagan practice, with maybe the exception of Anglicanism, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And they rejected the unnecessary Catholic rituals not stipulated in the Bible. They also gave sermons in their vernacular languages, not in the traditional Latin, and they used the printing press to make the Bible, widely available to people in their vernacular languages, widely translating the Bible, a practice kind of long frowned upon by the Catholic Church. Because obviously, new translations could lead to inserting new agendas into the text very subtly. Architecturally, the Calvinists and the Lutherans were disgusted by, the showiness and theatricality of Catholic churches, preferring, very austere, undecorated churches that functioned, not as holy spaces housing relics and saints, but very secular meeting rooms to review the gospel. And they selected their own ministers directly from their congregations rather than having, an authority from above appoint one as in the Catholic Church. And so these Protestants began by, whitewashing their existing Catholic churches, stripping all statuary and paintings from the walls in order to mark them out as no-nonsense Protestant churches. And so really by 1700, Europe stood divided into Catholic countries in the south, broadly Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, and Austria, and Protestant countries in the north, broadly England, Switzerland, many of the German states, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. And the Protestant Netherlands were the first independent, fully Protestant nation which had rebelled against the Habsburgs in 1568. And this led to the foundation of the Dutch Union, or the Netherlands as they're known today, founded in 1579. And they set up this brand new political system inspired by the merchant republics of Italy, meaning they formed a republic out of 7 provinces. And also, similar to Venice, one of these republics from Italy, the cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Delft were run by merchant classes voted into office for 2-year terms. By 1700, Amsterdam developed into the most powerful city of this Dutch Union. Visitors here marveled at the absence of poverty and social equality among its inhabitants. It was unlike anything seen at the time, so much so that the city's elite appeared indistinguishable from the common people. The very facades of the houses here lining the city's major canals had conformed to an obvious code of Republican moderation in which everyone seemed equally well off. The modest exterior, however, could conceal luxurious interiors for the wealthier Dutch merchant families. And as Amsterdam grew, they eventually wrapped 3 levels of canals around the city core, imitating Venice, their model of aspiration, intentionally here kind of rejecting the grand axis and streets leading to palaces and cathedrals, right? The traditional symbols of monarchy and theocracy, which they were trying to get away from with their founding of this republic. As you can imagine, this lack of hierarchy was ideal to the Protestant ethic of social balance and not displaying worldly wealth and power. Also, a very literal reading of the Bible. But Amsterdam's building plots as the city expanded actually remained the dimensions of the narrow medieval hall plots of old, but now housed these very long, modest brick townhouses to encourage this facade of equality. So Amsterdam's townhouses ended up growing upward 3 or 4 stories instead of outward, often with a crane at the apex of the gable, at the apex of the roof, to haul furniture and goods in through these large windows when people needed to carry things up to the top floors. But despite this conformity of scale, every townhouse facade was really unique. No two were alike. Some carried decorative pilasters, rusticated window frames, carved ornaments, or fancy brickwork, but their greatest expression was always on the gable of the roof. They had these uniquely articulated gables decorated with steps, scroll urns, or floral carvings, Greek pediments, or a whole host of other expressions. And of course, as mentioned before, the first Protestant churches of Amsterdam really worked to reverse the decorative excesses of Catholicism. So at first, these Dutch Protestants renovated their existing Catholic churches, mostly Gothic churches, by absolutely stripping the sculptures and paintings from the inside and out and plastering their piers and walls in white plaster. They also typically took out all of the lavishly decorated altars, choirs, and rood screens, leaving this very empty shell of a former Gothic church. And instead of focusing on an altar way at one end of the nave, they built these centrally placed wooden speaking pulpits capped with these wooden sounding boards to spread the voice of the preacher all throughout the church. And so the Protestant liturgy really shifted here from ritualistic to auditory needs. So, whereas the overarching purpose of the Catholic Mass was to administer the Eucharist, the bread and wine for salvation, worked up through, these series of elaborate rituals and processions, the purpose of the Protestant Mass now was to inspire faith and review Scripture. So Protestants favored everyone gathering around a central point rather than, facing one distant end of the hall where the Catholic altar was situated. So here in Protestant churches, churchgoers gathered around the pulpit as the minister, a member of the community, conducted the service by reviewing Scripture and giving his own commentary. And Dutch painters actually in the 1600s captured the new, very casual atmosphere of these Protestant churches. They were no longer holy places demanding respect as Catholic churches were. You can see men wore hats inside, people brought in their dogs, and they really functioned as secular meeting places outside of service hours, much like Roman basilicas had. And so all over Protestant Europe, churches essentially became little more than meeting halls for going over the Scriptures. Very little ritual was conducted here. No holy tombs were seen again, and saint veneration was no longer to be found in these halls. But the earliest new churches in Amsterdam built for the purpose of conducting the perfect Protestant ritual were the Zuiderkerk and the Westerkerk, both designed by architect Hendrik de Keyser. Rather than taking on the names of saints as you would see in Catholic churches, they acquired these very generic names based on geography. It just means Southern Church and Western Church, relating to, the southern part of the city and the western part of the city. And these churches did keep to the traditional, longitudinal plans of basilica-type churches. And De Keyser kind of developed his style from these early Baroque pattern books, but blended it with, the perpendicular Gothic windows then popular in the last Gothic churches built in Northern Europe at this time. And although blending Baroque and Gothic architectural elements, De Keyser kept it very, very sparse and austere on the exterior and the interior. The most decoration you would see on the inside were these kind of white plastered interiors marked by only simple columns and pilasters. And really the only parts of his churches where he, allowed himself some real expression were the steeples on top, crowned in, these 3 to 4 tiers of engaged columns with a bulb dome on top. But these merely were intended to, characterize one church from another in order to sort of break the skyline of the city as these recognizable monuments and direct people to mass via their height and bells. Later, Protestant churches built by the second generation of Dutch architects were designed in Greek cross plans with groin vault ceilings, as opposed to the typical Greek dome with the pulpit to one side to best suit the acoustics. And so, this way, more parishioners, at first standing and then later in pews, could fit much more closely around the pulpit to hear the sermon, and without a high dome, of course, sound couldn't travel far before it was funneled directly back down to the parishioners. And again, the interiors here were whitewashed and unadorned, but were now very, very bright, maximizing window space in lieu of artwork. There would be, none of the dark, mysterious chapels of Catholic cathedrals. There was no need for them. There were no saints to revere. Typically, the exteriors here were just articulated with these very basic giant round arched windows and simple pilasters to kind of break up the mass of bricks. But of course, the second generation of Dutch architects carried over the steeples, typically building the steeple centrally but set to one side, framing the entrance, or else set directly in the center above the central crossing. And while the majority of Dutch residents were Protestants, the Netherlands fostered a previously unseen level of religious tolerance, permitting Jews, Catholics, and all varieties of Protestants the equal right to worship, encouraging them to, build churches and synagogues for their denominations. And it resembled the city's centrally planned Protestant churches, perfectly square in plan, but because of the frontal focus of Jewish worship, a barrel vault formed a central nave, flanked by these 2 vaulted aisles with galleries for women to sit. But of course, the exterior conformed to the very severely stripped down style of other Dutch religious buildings, presenting these tall brick volumes broken up by simple pilasters. The only building the Dutch of Amsterdam let themselves sort of be ostentatious with was the most important public building of the City Hall. This palace rose as one of the largest secular buildings in 1600s Europe. A stilted dome here rose over the central point in the style of Amsterdam's steeples with engaged columns and arches. This was actually the first dome used in a non-religious public building, which rose higher than any church in the city, taking away the privilege of crowning the city from the church. And inside this palace, Amsterdam ran their government. They elected 4 burgomasters who each served 2 years, who occupied offices directly under the pediment. And from inside this building, they also ran the rest of Amsterdam's bureaucracy and the state bank, the richest bank in all of Europe. The great central hall of the building served as the entry foyer and meeting hall, which led one to the various wings of the building. And so, imposing yet classically modest, Amsterdam's City Hall offered a Protestant response to, the excesses of Versailles. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation presented this huge incentive for kings all across Europe to break with the Pope. So, instead of the Pope having all the money and power from his Catholic churches, the king themselves could have it. So by, converting their country to Protestantism, this allowed them to essentially confiscate church land from the Catholic Church, collect church taxes now, and use church land for themselves. So this Reformation in some countries also had sort of a political dimension. And so one great example is England. So, as Calvinism and Lutheranism spread throughout Europe, England kind of fell into its own Reformation. By 1534, King Henry VIII was one of the first monarchs of Europe who actually prompted his own Reformation for political reasons. Essentially, the story goes, and you might have heard it, that the Pope would not grant Henry a divorce from his buried first wife. So Henry established the Anglican Church, the Church of England, also known as the Protestant Church of England, as the official religion of England. He also made himself and all future monarchs the head of the church. And so right after this, Henry VIII actually closed and confiscated the land of every single monastery and nunnery in England and Wales, because nearly 900 of them had owned 20% of the land in England. But, monasteries were technically agents of the Catholic Church of Rome, independent landholders really answerable to the Pope alone. And so Henry's counselor essentially calculated that monasteries had this collective annual income of over 150 million pounds from tithes, taxes given to the church, pilgrimage funds, and selling indulgences, yet were only giving around 5% of it to the poor. So he had this great moral and religious incentive to break with the Pope as well. And so these monasteries to the court of Henry VIII simply had to go. Henry shut them down and used their estates to give or sell to his supporters or gain new ones. And so in the end, he ended up making over 500 million pounds in today's money. So here in these monasteries, the treasures were all of a sudden melted down, their roofs were typically stripped of their lead, and their libraries sacked. Many monasteries were left to languish as ruins and remain so today in the English landscape. And so it was with this sort of monastic counter-reaction that the old medieval world really lost many of its surviving art and artifacts. But the majority of English Christians at the time longed to keep the rituals and theatricality of, Catholicism, as well as the saint veneration of Catholicism in their new Anglicanism, but to sort of adopt the theology of Protestantism, wherein, salvation could only be obtained through faith, not by confession to a priest, not by indulgences, not by pilgrimage, and not by other good works. But there was a minority camp, one that eventually split off from the Anglicans. This minority camp, called the Puritans, thought that the new Anglican Church hadn't gone far enough. It was still much too similar to the Catholic Church. So they positioned for a much more extreme reform to eradicate any religious practice that was not immediately outlined in the Bible. They wanted to completely abolish church hierarchy, church traditions, creating churches staffed by the community, like in Amsterdam. But they differed in that they believed God would protect them if they obeyed every religious law to the letter, with very, very little room for forgiveness. And this understandably led them to lead extremely strict religious lives, hence people began calling them Puritans. But after Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, died, England was marred by nasty politics. Edward was succeeded by his half-sister, Mary I, this very passionate Catholic woman who burnt around 300 Protestants at the stake as heretics, as many other Puritans fled into exile to America and to the continent. On Mary's death in 1558, her half-sister Elizabeth I became Queen of England, who was actually a devout Protestant. And so here, some Puritans returned to England, yet still constantly petitioned for, religious reform in the Church of England, in the Anglican Church, which they still, of course, thought held on to too many Catholic rituals and theology. But finally, in Elizabeth's death in 1603, James I ascended the throne, another Protestant, and he commissioned this widespread English translation of the Bible, the King James Bible, which spread very widely via the printing press, but still denied most Puritan demands for reform. So at this time, the Puritans officially broke from the Anglican Church, taking over their own churches and holding their own meetings of worship, sometimes illegally. But after James I's death, things got even worse. The new King Charles I was very Catholic again and wanted to lessen Puritan influence in the Anglican Church. So this forced even more Puritans to migrate to North America, and this is really where we get the famous story of, the Pilgrims and the founding of Jamestown. Finally, though, English Protestants instigated a civil war in England, which resulted in the beheading of this Charles I and the eventual re-establishment of the Anglican monarchy in 1660, for which it has really stayed the same ever since. So it had taken a really bloody, chaotic era to shake off Catholicism in England, but shake it off they did, and soon a convenient fire made way, in London at least, for the foundation of a new city full of new Protestant monuments. Unlike France, London's, labyrinth of medieval streets did not need to be cleared by legislation or property confiscation. In September 1666, a great fire roared through downtown London, absolutely gutting the medieval city and Gothic churches inside the old Roman city walls, while also extending a little past the wall to the west. And so, as you can imagine, this allowed for the complete resurveying of the streets in the densest quarter of London, and for the city to really redefine its new Anglican identity with a brand new line of churches. And among London's Reconstruction architects, a certain Christopher Wren had won the most fame. And this Wren took charge of the reconstruction of 50 churches destroyed downtown by this great fire, while, making it his lifetime project to rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral, London's cathedral, as the perfect reflection of England's new Anglican church. The earlier Gothic cathedral on the site, Old St. Paul's Cathedral as it's called today, was largely actually destroyed in the Great Fire and really unsalvageable, so the remaining ruins were pulled down. They were demolished in the 1670s. And, despite the still active Puritan undercurrent in England, which would, have liked to see churches like those in Amsterdam, Christopher Wren belonged to the other camp of Anglicanism, which really longed to keep the rituals and theatricality of Catholicism, as well as the saint veneration, but transition to the theology of Protestantism, wherein, salvation could only be obtained through faith. So Wren created some of the first defining Anglican churches in England in its sort of own architectural style in and around the 1660s as a sort of local variation of Renaissance classicism combined with European Baroque, which he called the English Baroque. And so England, in essence, really had its architectural renaissance after the 1660s, kickstarted by none other than this Christopher Wren. So Wren made it his lifetime project to rebuild St. Paul's, London's cathedral, on the highest point of London as the perfect really reflection of, England's new Anglican church. He wanted it to symbolize a sort of alternative center of the Christian world in England as opposed to Rome. And so, understandably, he built it largely in the Renaissance style of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome on the inside and the out, in a sort of attempt to even surpass the theatric center of the Catholic Church in Italy. So Wren was, obviously a huge fan of the Italian Renaissance, but also of the founding authors of the early Baroque, Mansart in France and Bernini in Italy. But Wren's design, also featured these very subtle but very English Gothic and Romanesque references. You have the steep spires, the very Romanesque windows here, but these are all, sort of organically situated amongst the Baroque references, the rife statuary, the bowing entablature, the gilded dentils and coffers, the balustrades on the roof, and the overuse of garlands. And this is all sort of an attempt to symbolize the ideals of the English Reformation, symbolize the ideals of Anglicanism. Since Anglicanism is, England's essentially version of Catholicism with Protestant overtones, Wren is really using the architecture of Catholic classicism with these, sort of English Gothic overtones So, to Wren, England's past could really be seen in the Gothic, but its future could be seen in the Baroque. So Wren's architectural vision for, Anglicanism was not unlike the Catholic Church. He wanted to use a sort of local variation of Renaissance classicism combined with the Baroque for defining, this new Anglican architecture distanced from the Puritans, more so, resembling the power of Catholicism in its architecture. And so Wren's magnificent dome, really an imitation of St. Peter's Dome, surrounded by the spires of Wren's other downtown churches, has dominated the London skyline for really over 300 years. It was the tallest building in London until 1963 and is still the second largest church in the UK. But, opinions of Wren's cathedral, as you can imagine, differed, with some loving it while others hating it with zeal. One famous reviewer wrote that there was an air of popery about the gilded capitals, the heavy arches. They were unfamiliar, un-English. And so really half the population wanted to see in its place a familiar Gothic cathedral, not this kind of model of Catholic Rome manifested by Christopher Wren, which they were clearly trying to get away from, not imitate. But to Wren, he wanted to make it clear that this was the Rome of England. England could essentially rebrand itself as the corrected Catholic Church. And still today, Anglican architecture remains really divided between Wren's sort of eclectic Baroque and Renaissance style and the more traditional Gothic buildings. But as I said, Wren also took charge of the reconstruction of 50 churches destroyed by the fire while working on his lifetime project of St. Paul's. These were much more restrained than St. Peter's. Like Amsterdam's Protestant churches, externally they were very austere brick framed by these subtle Baroque elements in limestone, but internally they could be really quite lavish and Baroque. And so Wren's parish churches, 24 actually survive today, occupy these sort of irregular sites crowded by adjacent structures. At the ground level, he really limited their theatricality, but above he gave them each a very distinctive steeple reminiscent of De Keizer's belfries in Amsterdam. But in order to sort of make them hold on to some sense of English identity, as they were these new Anglican churches, he topped them again with this Gothic spire, or at least some element resembling one, yet held up by these sort of classical details, once again blending English Gothicness and Catholic classicism to really represent Anglicanism. And so Wren's new downtown churches really defined London's new skyline as this sort of world of mini temples. But the interiors of Wren's churches had just as much variation. He built barrel-vaulted basilicas, Greek cross churches, and cross vaults like those in Amsterdam, or Greek cross churches capped by domes. And like the Dutch, Wren preferred the acoustic of a central plan because his ideal sermon was, a combination of Catholic and Protestant rituals with processions and Eucharistic rites, but also sermons in English where all could hear. Yet still, the walls were whitewashed. Here, England was experimenting with their own classical Renaissance revival, but dampening it with whitewashing and adding corruptions of the Netherlands steeples as a symbol of Protestantism. So in the second part of class today, we're going to look at really the continuation of the Baroque style peddled by the Catholic Church, and also its blossoming into these new, really interesting and beautiful sub-styles as it spread into Northern Europe during the 1700s. So as a very quick review from last week, the Roman Catholic Church had been promoting this kind of theatrical approach to its architecture as the sort of antithesis of those whitewashed Protestant churches to really stimulate enthusiasm and passion from the faithful, from the parishioners, especially to influence them not to turn to Protestantism percolating around Northern Europe. This new architecture and decor actually struck many critics originally as sort of bizarre, so they termed it Baroque, which means irregularly shaped, but soon this came to be embraced by the Catholic Church and later the royal courts all over Europe. So, to be very clear, the Baroque started in Rome in the late 1500s, but by the 1700s it had really spread to the rest of Catholic Europe. And in the early 1700s, the royal courts of Catholic Europe actually physically began visiting Rome for these grand architectural tours, and they typically brought back with them Italian architects really well versed in this new Roman Baroque style to build them new theatrical palaces, new Baroque downtowns, and new Baroque cathedrals. And so this resulted in, as you would expect, new sub-styles of the Baroque in the rest of Catholic Europe. So, the combination of the Roman Baroque style and sort of local vernacular styles really gave birth to these new, very unique, very beautiful, very ornate expressions of the Baroque, such as the very, flamboyant Turangaresque in Spain, or the very exuberant Rococo decoration of France and Germany. In both of these, decoration absolutely piled up to the point of even obscuring the clarity of the structure beneath. And so, despite Rome's, now diminished importance in power against that of France and Spain, it really remained the primary architecture school for the rest of Europe. Royal and aristocratic families of Europe began to send their children to study in the art academies of Rome. And Carlo Fontana, the most sought-after Baroque architect and teacher in Rome at the time, had actually been directly taught by Bernini and Borromini themselves, those architects which we talked about in the last lecture. And so he in turn trained dozens of Europe's up-and-coming Catholic Baroque architects. And so it's really thanks to Carlo Fontana that Baroque tastes were unleashed across most of Catholic Europe. And Fontana's Baroque style was, very much descended from Bernini, very openly inspired by the sort of stage set type promoted by Bernini. And so inside his churches, he really made the altar the center stage, and every inch of fluff around it was full of, backdrops of painted angels and clouds and gilded pilasters and coffers to really frame the rituals of Catholic priests as these theatrical stage sets. And even the facades, the outsides of his churches were built like stage sets, which really broke the rules of classicism. They looked like backdrops of theaters at the time, full of these concave curves and broken pediments and aedicules framing the statues of saints and angels. The facades of his churches kind of curved like a stage to embrace anyone ascending the steps, as if to, sort of remind parishioners that they were about to witness a holy performance in the rituals of the Catholic clergy. So the Baroque, first of all, had this very strong influence in the rebuilding of Sicily because its towns and cities had really badly suffered from a catastrophic earthquake in 1693. And so the major city of Sicily at the time, Catania, had its downtown actually completely rebuilt, the buildings and the church, with these kind of straight streets about twice the size, twice the width of that of the normal European street, with these kind of regularly placed Baroque plazas. And as you can imagine, after this major disaster, fire safety and mobility became Catania's most important criteria for street building, leading to this, emphasis on these wide, unobstructed straight roads. And the young architect in charge of this reconstruction, Vaccarini, was actually born in Sicily but had trained with Fontana's son back in Rome. And so he brought the Roman Baroque style to the city using the abundant supply of lava stone in combination with the, traditional white limestone of Rome's Baroque for the major buildings and rebuilding of the cathedral, kind of putting a, Sicilian vernacular twist on the traditional Baroque style of Rome with, traditional Sicilian building materials. Another architect of Sicily's reconstruction, Rosario Gagliardi, never went to Rome but learned from Vaccarini. His greatest innovation, which had no apparent precedent in Sicily, was to incorporate the champanelle into the facade, this bell tower traditionally offset from basilica churches. But of course, the Baroque was about breaking rules, so there was nothing wrong with this. He thrust the front portal forward as this single door on the curve of the Champanelle, with these 4 tiers of ascending colonnades. And he flourished his windows and doors by framing them with garlands and fantastical aedicules, and topped the front facade with heavy set balustrades. Like many churches in the Italian tradition, the presenting face mattered, so the front and inside of the church were just as lavish as one another, while the sides were rather plain. Bernard Fischer was another famous Baroque architect who had trained in Rome, but coming from further afield in Austria, and his talents led to his own important commissions back home. Fischer's scholarly interest in multiple cultural sources, surfaced in his work in Vienna, the Karlskirche, his life's legacy, this votive church designed in 1713 and finished after his death by his son. It's, very tall oval dome and side belfries with bulging crowns, fronted by a temple front, resembled other Baroque works, right? This was a very Baroque thing to do, and included other Baroque details like urns and volutes. But the placement of 2 historiated columns to either side of the temple front were straight from another time. They alluded to the spiraling column of Trajan, which we talked about towards the beginning of this class. The columns, though, actually, instead of displaying scenes from Trajan's campaigns, of course, display scenes from the life of Charles Borromeo, a famous Austrian archbishop and saint, in the spiral reliefs. Furthermore, these columns are kind of intended to recall the 2 columns that stood in front of the first temple at Jerusalem. In the 1720s, the French and Catholic Germans started experimenting with a new take on Baroque called Rococo. And this new style, Rococo, was actually named after the French word for grotto rock formations, rocale, and I'm sure you can see why. Rococo was, so over the top with its floral designs and intricate carvings that it really resembles the intricacy of these rock formations. It was all about, embracing nature's patterns and loosening up the strict classical style, even the slightly strict Baroque style comparatively. Think intricate carvings, floral designs, scrolling curves, pastel colors were used a lot, and very over-the-top decorations, often covered in gold or silver. This was a very boastful style. So originally, French designers used Rococo for estates built for the nobility. This decorative overload matched perfectly with, the huge elaborate powdered wigs and costumes that aristocrats in France were wearing at the time. But it quickly spread to Germany and soon even influenced church designs in Northern Europe. So the Amalienburg Pavilion here, what you see, is one of actually the earliest examples of a French estate using Rococo. And so, as a result, the Baroque and Rococo substyle became massively popular in the first half of the 1700s, and more than 200 new Baroque and Rococo churches appeared suddenly in Bavaria, Germany, often replacing the old Gothic pilgrimage churches. So this particular pilgrimage church that you see actually replaced a Gothic holy chapel in and around 1743. And basically, to make a long story short, the story goes that, the original Gothic chapel on the site was built by a very humble shepherd who essentially had visions that this would be a great site for healing miracles because it was kind of the forgotten resting place of several saints. And sure enough, after he built this very modest Gothic chapel on the site, the healing miracles began. People would approach this chapel with various sicknesses and ailments and be miraculously healed. And so this very Rococo church was designed to replace it. It was meant to, bring greater glory to the site. And like the shepherd, one was here meant to see, a regular, almost boring church on the outside, but be absolutely astounded with the miracle it was on the inside, a space that's almost incomprehensible. So here the architect kind of treated the facade with restraint, the entry bay slightly bulging between 2 bell towers, but otherwise very much recalling, if you'll remember, Carolingian Romanesque Westworks. but the interior glistened with colored marble, painted plaster ceiling vaults, undulating balconies, these painted sculptures of angels sort of flitting in the midair, and strands of sinuous over-the-top Rococo ornament. All of these sort of maximalist sculptural decorations almost obscured the complexity of the curves and counter curves that shaped the nave. One could, almost visit this church many, many times and always catch something new in the decorations. But overall, it was really something unseen in the history of Western religious architecture, with, its intense obsession with orthogonal buildings, really since Hagar came in the prehistoric era, which you'll remember from the first lecture. The series of ovals here really played against the stiff outer walls, kind of like internal organs contained within the skin of a body. This church almost felt like it could breathe. Meanwhile, beginning in the 1600s, Spain's profiting from the spice trade in India, the slave trade in Africa, and eventually the cash crops from the Americas, built Spain's finest palaces and sacred spaces since Al-Andalus in the early medieval period. In addition, the Spanish gold mined and stolen from America was put to use in the incredibly ornate readable screens that crowded the altars in churches of Spain. And so, at the minimum, a readable screen is essentially a shelf for candles behind the altar, but it grew to be these large, elaborate structures, especially in Spain. It usually here incorporates sculptures and paintings of saints, angels, and occasionally Jesus, and sometimes houses the primary relics of the church. So by the 1700s, Spain's flavor of the Baroque had emerged, the Charangeresque or Ultra Baroque, which would spread to Spain's American colonies as well. And this new Charangeresque style is actually just simply named after the Charega family of Spanish sculptors and architects who made these gold readable screens first from Aztec gold of amazing complexity, very plainly seen here. And so the Charangeresque style is essentially a mix of Gothic, Baroque, and those kind of Muslim motifs inherited from Al-Andalusian architecture way back in early medieval Spain, whose, monuments still exist for inspiration in this period. And so, you can recognize it really by its absolutely maximalist, expressive and florid detailing and curved surfaces and twisted columns. Look closer and it almost looks as if the gold, marble, plaster, and stone has been essentially turned into lace. It's been, so finely worked with carved decor. Also redone in this Charangeresque style is the facade of this church that was redone in the 1740s. This is the Church of Santiago de Compostela, the most famous church in Spain, Spain's most important pilgrimage church because it houses the shrine of James the Apostle, one of Jesus' closest disciples, which had, until its renovation, really remained a very traditional Romanesque church, and the inside continues to remain Romanesque today, but the outside, the facade that was redone in this Charangeresque style, is absolutely covered in sculpture. And let me just go over some key recognizable figures. In the middle of the facade can be seen a statue of Saint James, and one level below are depicted his two disciples, Athanasius and Theodore, all dressed as pilgrims to sort of inspire and encourage the thousands of pilgrims coming here every year. Meanwhile, the tower on the right depicts Mary Salome, the mother of St. James, whereas the tower on the left depicts his father Zebedee, both mentioned many times in the New Testament. Finally, moving across the Atlantic Ocean, really from the 1500s to the 1700s, as we kind of touched upon in the past, newcomers from Spain claimed lands in the Americas, and the indigenous populations, as I'm sure you know, tragically ended up enslaved or devastated by diseases. But soon, other countries followed with this colonization effort in the Americas. Soon, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, England, and England's Puritans all themselves established colonies in the Americas, bringing the architecture of Europe, of course, with them. But of all of these new European colonists, the quickest success was had in Mexico, then known as New Spain. And of course, just a generation after the first Spanish contact, the surviving members of the native populations converted to Christianity. And so the Spanish themselves in New Spain in Mexico planned these very spread out but orthogonal settlements that sheltered the Spanish minority and urbanized, the previously largely pastoral native populations. And so by the 1700s, Mexico had become essentially a landscape of thriving cities served by aqueducts and domed cathedrals. And outside these main cities, the Spanish colonies actually established mining and manufacturing towns on the backs of indigenous slaves. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church sent missionaries of their own who founded well over 400 self-supporting monasteries, frequently, sited on the top of destroyed ancient sites and pyramids from the Aztecs. And the abbots and monks staffing these new monasteries frequently actually advocated for the mistreated indigenous people. Very famously, Friar Bartolome de las Casas in particular denounced, the appalling injustices of the colonizers to the king, demanding in his famous quote, "Tell me by what injustice do you hold these Indians in such a cruel and horrible servitude?" And so as a result, really by the end of the 1500s, Spain reformed the mining and manufacturing towns into, proper estates with poorly paid indigenous laborers, technically at this point not slaves, but very poorly treated nonetheless. But as you could guess, Mexico City was the capital of New Spain, actually on the old site of Tenochtitlan. It was, the center of the Spanish presence in South America. It had, administrative rights over all Spanish territories, even over much of the Caribbean. And the city's plan in the 1520s was actually designed to replace the ruins of Aztec Tenochtitlan, but old Tenochtitlan was and still is preserved in some small way. Mexico City's new grid followed the old orthogonal grid of the ancient city. And the major square at the center of the city actually replaced the square of the Coatpedal Temple and the Aztec Palace, by far exceeding the dimensions of, any square back in Europe, back in Spain. And so the conquistadors, of course, needed to build at the center of their new Mexico City a cathedral on the site of Coatpedal Temple in 1525 as a sort of symbol of Spanish and Catholic power over the gods of the native Aztecs. And according to writings, the original church had 3 naves separated by Tuscan columns and a ceiling with very intricate carvings and a front facade in the Italian Renaissance style. And for the construction of this temple, they actually repurposed the stones from the destroyed Aztec temple. But in spite of everything, soon this old cathedral was considered insufficient for the growing size and importance of the new capital, and a new cathedral was planned to be built in its place in 1573, using the same stones among new ones to create, a much larger cathedral for the rapidly growing population in Mexico City. And by its completion, it was the largest church in the Western Hemisphere, built in this sort of restrained Baroque style popular at the time, with a mixed Gothic and Romanesque interior, boasting 2 bell towers, a vaulted nave sustained by massive buttresses, and a grand dome at the crossing. But the Tarangaresque style, soon growing in popularity across the Atlantic in Spain, as we just saw, would soon make its first debut in Mexico City. In 1748, this chapel was added to the south, using a Greek cross plan and clad in, this classic highly ornate Tarangaresque facade. Also in the early 1700s, the nearby city of Querétaro embarked on this impressive work of infrastructure that still survives today, this 74-arch aqueduct, recalling the glories of ancient Rome, or more appropriately, the glories of the ancient Aztecs, as they too had their own aqueducts. The water here emptied into 10 public fountains built in the city's plaza and diffused into a further 60 private fountains for religious settlements and, large private houses or mansions. Spain's first government buildings actually took the form of sort of Renaissance palaces, these kind of square blocks of classical or Baroque facades centered around internal colonnaded courtyards because, the tame and hot climate encouraged such open buildings, allowing, wind to cool but, ample shade to protect. And one of the best surviving early government buildings in Mexico City was this headquarters of the Inquisition in the colony of New Spain. And so the Dominican monks, the Dominican order whom the papacy had, invested with Inquisition duties in this new colonies, arrived in Mexico City in and around 1526 to build a monastery on this site to bring the Spanish Inquisition to the New World, which had begun all the way back in 1478 in Spain. And so quickly let me go over the history of the Inquisition. So Spain in the 1400s was, very diverse religiously with, Muslims held over from Al-Andalus, Jews and Christians really regularly living and worshiping in the same towns. So the Inquisition began in 1478 under the command of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to, rid Spain of all of these non-Catholics. And it would last more than 350 years and affect all of the Spanish colonies. The Inquisition marked its arrival essentially in any new place with an edict of grace, typically lasting 40 days, which, promised mercy to those who confessed heresy and converted to Catholicism in the presence of the Inquisitor Dominicans, this order of monks, or else allowed them to leave the kingdom. And so during this period, thousands of Jews and Muslims actually migrated to Central Europe. But after the Edict of Grace expired after 40 days, the inquisitors held court cases for those accused of heresy, and if proven guilty, based on the severity of the heresy, they could be forced to wear a special garment that marked them out, their property could be confiscated, they could be exiled, or on the extreme end, they were tortured, imprisoned for months or years, or even burned publicly at the stake for repeated offenses. And so the Spanish Inquisition was, really driven by fear. It was essentially this string of laws to ensure religious orthodoxy in the face of the Protestant Reformation happening very near to Spain, right? And of course, in the American colonies, it really served to hunt down indigenous pagans and force them to convert. So, everyone part of Spain and its colonies was now to be Roman Catholic. And so, this, as you can imagine, resulted in many forced conversions. And so, of course, this order of monks, the Dominicans, arrived in Mexico City in 1526 as inquisitors and built for themselves a monastery to, carry out their strict lifestyle and, of course, hold court cases for judging heretics. But of course, this could be disruptive to monastic life, so in the 1710s, the Mexico City government built a proper headquarters for these Dominicans to judge heretics next to their monastery, and this is the building you see today. Today, thankfully, though, it has been converted into the Museum of Mexican Medicine, but originally it contained proper judicial hearing rooms, judges' chambers, a jail, and accommodation for the Dominican inquisitors. So this new building was kind of wrapped in red volcanic stones and framed in these kind of limestone Baroque decors. But instead of, placing the entry mid-block, it was placed at the corner. And so if you can imagine, the accused heretics were marched into this diagonal entryway and into the courtyard inside, where they were to await their trial while they were watched, indeed, looked down upon by the Dominican inquisitors who held their offices on the second level of the courtyard. And amazingly, the corner columns in this courtyard were actually removed where you would expect to find them doubled, and this was to, assist the uninterrupted flow between the courtroom and the entrance. But in reality, they were, part of these subtle cross arches that were kind of supported by pillars attached to the walls and the first columns on each side. In the end, though, New Spain had a much more tame Inquisition than that of Old Spain. In all, about 324 people were prosecuted and 50 were burned, until finally these laws were abolished in 1820. Compare that to the, around 3,000 to 5,000 people executed in the whole of the Inquisition back in Spain. Finally, let's get back to the Puritans at the end of class, those, Protestant radicals who considered the Anglican Church too Catholic. They had founded the earliest towns in New England, since fleeing the religious turmoil in England, which we went over earlier in this lecture, and they founded new towns in North America as early as 1620 at Plymouth. And after the British had established their own colonies at Boston and Newport, the Puritan towns kind of continued as these separate, discrete communities. So, these Puritan towns really founded between 1620 and 1650 remained these kind of intentionally small and, self-sufficient villages with each village, possessing all the skills necessary to sustain these kind of closed religious communities. And the righteousness of these kind of strict Puritan colonies often led to these, exclusive theocratic atmospheres ruled by religion, ruled by priests, not, unlike Mexico City, which eventually culminated for the Puritans in the Salem witch trials of 1692. This episode of mass hysteria where 200 people, primarily teenage girls, were accused of witchcraft, 30 found guilty under torture, and 19 executed. But Puritan towns essentially divided their colonies into two realms. They marked off a common pasture and farmland to one side of the village while they lived in these kind of patchy, spread out houses centered around one main street. And the settlers divided these lands according to merit, with, the size of each allotment reflecting, the relative amount each member had contributed to the initial expense of the enterprise. And so at the focal point of this central street, or the midpoints of their towns, these Puritan planners usually built meeting houses as the sort of political, educational, and religious focus of their towns. And they called it the meeting house in order to really suggest that, politics, education, and religion should not be separate in a proper God-fearing society, but sort of bundled together in one building to avoid, association with Catholics and Anglicans, who of course separated their church, education, and state. So here in these meeting houses, not only did Puritans hold mass, but they also elected the town leaders and priests, held court cases, hosted a town school for their children, and generally held town meetings here. And the old ship meeting house in Hingham, Massachusetts, which you see here, built in 1681, is actually the oldest surviving Puritan meeting house in the entire US. But as such, it is also the oldest continuously used church building in the US. And initially, the old ship meeting house was actually documented as this old thatched log meeting house, very similar to, the earliest Puritan houses on the site, built closer to Hingham's founding in 1535. But then it was rebuilt to accommodate, of course, the growing colony in 1681, with much, sturdier clapboard cladding and cedar shingles, but still in the classical Protestant style, devoid of any ornamentation. And so, with this stark wooden pulpit and stripped down interior, it could not have been further from the very ornate Baroque churches popularizing back in Anglican England. It, of course, instead inspired to the Puritan ideal of a Dutch-inspired centrally planned church with the pulpit in the middle against the north wall, accessible to all and topped by a sounding board. Outside, of course, the roof was capped with an open belfry, which served, not only to call the faithful to mass, but also to call the accused to court, and of course to call the children to school. And this hipped roof with a sort of central steeple raised on this kind of open truss structure with these kind of curved struts were called really the frame structure of a ship, reflecting the prowess of the Puritans as shipbuilders. And originally this building was furnished with backless wooden benches, these very uncomfortable seats, with more comfortable box pews finally being installed in 1755 after the manner of Dutch churches. And finally, in the Victorian period, having ceased to be a Puritan town, the box pews were actually removed and replaced with these very fancy curved pews, sort of fanning outward from the pulpit, while the walls were wallpapered with Baroque ornament and drapes were added to the windows. But the church in and around 1930 was restored to its current appearance, reflecting, its more original 18th century characteristics. And as I said, this remains the oldest church building in continuous use in the US, so it's definitely worth a visit, though now it's a Unitarian church.